Tonight, we open a door the world was never meant to see, a story older than Rome, carved into stone and whispered across deserts, yet locked away beneath Vatican walls. This is not just about Egypt's gods or Christian saints. It is about a thread that binds them together, a gospel that should not exist, one that makes the story of resurrection older than Moses, older than Jerusalem, older than the cross itself. For centuries, the Vatican has displayed Egyptian obelisks in its squares and hidden Egyptian scrolls in its vaults. But why? What knowledge was too dangerous to reveal, too powerful to burn, yet too sacred to share? Some say it is a text that shows Osiris, the dismembered and risen god of the Nile, as the first echo of the Passion story. What if the story of death and rising was not born in Galilee, but along the banks of the Nile? What if the Gospel of Osiris still exists, disguised as funerary papyri, misfiled in museums, sealed in archives only a handful have ever entered? Before you dismiss this as another legend, ask yourself, why has the Church preserved so much Egyptian imagery, from the mother in blue crowned with stars, to the obelisks that cast their shadows on street? Peter's Square? Like the video. Subscribe. Because tonight, we follow the river back to its source, and what we find may change how history itself is remembered. Stand in the heart of Rome, in the vast square before the great Basilica of St. Peter, and let your eyes rise upward. The marble floor stretches wide, the colonnades embrace the crowd like open arms, and at the very centre, piercing the sky, is a monument that does not belong. A giant needle of red granite, hauled from the deserts of Egypt thousands of years before Christ, standing not in Cairo or Thebes, but in the middle of the Vatican. The Church calls it a symbol of triumph, a relic of empire, but the stone whispers another story. Imagine it for a moment. The holiest site of Christianity crowned not by a cross, not by a relic of Peter or Paul, but by a monument raised for the gods of Egypt. Every pilgrim who enters St. Peter's Square walks beneath its shadow. Every pope who blesses the crowd does so in its presence. The paradox is breathtaking. The very centre of Catholic power rests upon the memory of Osiris. The obelisk itself is older than the Gospels, older than Rome's empire, older even than the Caesars, who once worshipped foreign gods in secret. It was carved in Heliopolis, city of the sun, and carried across the sea to adorn a circus where blood once stained the sand. In that circus, legend says, Peter himself was executed, and so the Vatican would later claim the obelisk as Christian victory, a silent trophy of paganism. But there is another possibility, darker and stranger. What if it was not taken to erase Egypt, but to preserve it? What if hidden beneath the layers of marble, incense, and Latin prayers lies a thread that stretches back to the Nile? A lost gospel not of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but of Osiris, the god who died and rose long before Christ. This is where the mystery begins, because Osiris was more than a myth. He was the king who was murdered, cut to pieces, and resurrected by the devotion of Isis. His story, told in temples long before the first Christian hymn, carried a shape that feels hauntingly familiar: death, burial, mourning, resurrection, and eternal life. The parallels are too close to ignore, yet the Church rarely speaks of them. Instead, it built its greatest temple around the shadow of Egypt's stone, as if to guard a memory too dangerous to name. So, what is the obelisk really doing here? Was it simply a trophy of empire, or was it a marker pointing back to something Rome could not erase? Some researchers whisper that beneath St. Peter's lies a chamber sealed not with gold, but with papyrus. A document written in the blending tongues of Greek and Coptic. A gospel that tells the story of Christ not as a lone saviour, but as the inheritor of Osiris. Imagine what such a text would mean. A bridge between Nile and Tiber. A revelation that the roots of Christianity are entangled with the oldest mystery religion on earth. The Vatican denies this, of course. The obelisk is explained away as history, nothing more. Yet, as you stand in its shadow, you cannot help but feel the weight of contradiction. A Christian world built on Egyptian stone. A gospel that may have survived, hidden, waiting. The question is not whether the obelisk belongs here. The question is what it remembers, and whether the Church has worked for centuries to keep that memory silent. Walk the streets of Rome after sunset, and you will find the Vatican transformed. The tourists have gone, the chanting has faded, and only the echo of your footsteps follows you along the ancient walls. The lamps burn low, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, and in that silence, the city feels older, as if it remembers things it has sworn to forget. Beneath those walls lies the Tiber, black and slow, carrying secrets through its dark waters. Rome has always hidden its mysteries underground, in catacombs, crypts, and tunnels that stretch like veins beneath the city. And some say, among those tunnels is where the most dangerous gospel was hidden. Archivists whisper about it late at night, men and women with keys who move like ghosts through marble halls. They do not speak openly, but in quiet corners of Roman cafes, over espresso and shadows, you may hear fragments of their fears. A papyrus, sealed centuries ago, buried not in the desert sands of Egypt, but in the vaults beneath the Tiber. A text said to retell the Passion of Christ, but not through the eyes of the apostles. Instead, through the lens of Osiris. Imagine such a manuscript, the crucifixion described not as a unique event, but as part of a cycle, one that had already been told in Egypt. A king betrayed, killed, and entombed. A grieving woman who gathers the broken pieces of his body. A miracle of resurrection that proves life triumphs over death. This is the story of Osiris, but it is also the shape of the Gospels. If such a papyrus exists, it would not deny Christ, but it would change him. It would show that his story was not born in isolation, but was part of something far older, stretching back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile. For the Church, this would be catastrophic. It would mean that the Passion was not only revelation, but repetition, that salvation was written into humanity long before the cross. To admit this would be to admit that Christianity is not a new beginning, but an echo. And so the papyrus remains locked away, if it exists at all, watched by archivists who carry keys but never speak names. There are legends of men who sought it. A Jesuit in the 17th century who died mysteriously days after requesting access to an unnamed scroll. A German scholar in the 19th century who claimed he saw references to Osiris written in a hand more familiar with Greek than Latin. He published nothing and vanished from records after a single letter sent from Rome. In the 20th century, whispers of excavation beneath the Vatican revealed nothing except rumours of sealed chambers filled with dust and silence. The river runs on, black beneath the bridges, as the city sleeps. But the whispers persist. A papyrus that could retell the gospel, not as a story of one man, but as a myth reborn. A secret so dangerous that the safest place to keep it was not to destroy it, but to bury it beneath the very city that crowned Christ's church. And sometimes, on nights when the wind rattles the shutters along the Tiber, you might wonder if the river itself remembers. Long before Rome was born, before temples rose on the hills of Jerusalem, a story was already being told along the banks of the Nile. It was the story of Osiris, the green-skinned king, the god who taught humanity how to farm the earth and how to live in harmony with the floods of the river. He was loved as a ruler, praised as a bringer of life, but his very goodness became the reason for his downfall. For in his own family lurked betrayal. His brother, Set, burned with envy. He desired the throne, the power, and the devotion Osiris received, and so he plotted a murder unlike any other. The legend says Set crafted a chest of perfect beauty, made to fit the exact body of Osiris. At a banquet filled with music and wine, he unveiled it to the guests, declaring that whoever fit inside could keep it as a prize. One by one they tried, laughing, failing, until Osiris stepped forward. He lay down, and the lid closed with a snap. In an instant, Set and his followers poured molten lead over the seams, sealing the chest tight, and cast it into the Nile. The waters carried Osiris away, and with him the light of Egypt dimmed. But the story did not end there. Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris, refused to accept death's silence. She wandered the world, searching for the chest, guided by grief and devotion. When she found it at last, hidden in a foreign land, she brought it back to Egypt. Yet Set discovered her secret. In rage, he tore the body of Osiris into pieces, scattering them across the land, hiding them in swamps, deserts, and deep waters. It was the final cruelty, to erase even the memory of wholeness. Still, Isis did not give up. She searched again, this time for fragments. With the help of her sister Nephthys and the jackal-headed Anubis, she gathered the parts, wrapping them carefully in linen, binding them together, reassembling what had been broken. She breathed life into him with spells older than kings, and Osiris rose once more. Not as a mortal, but as lord of the underworld, ruler of eternity, the god who showed that death could be conquered. From him came Horus, his son, who avenged him and carried his throne. From him came the promise that the dead could rise again, that the grave was not the end. The tale of Osiris was carved on temple walls and painted on papyrus scrolls long before the first gospel was written. To Egyptians, it was more than myth, it was a pattern, the cycle of life and death, repeating with the flooding of the Nile, the withering of crops, the return of the green fields. Death, scattering, reassembly, resurrection. A story older than Rome itself, yet hauntingly familiar to anyone who has heard of a cross, a tomb, and a stone rolled away. Osiris was not just a god of Egypt. He was the first blueprint of salvation, a story so powerful that echoes of it may still whisper in the heart of the Vatican today. Picture the city of Alexandria in the 1st century. The harbour brimming with ships, sails from every corner of the Mediterranean snapping in the wind. The air heavy with spice, papyrus rolls stacked in stalls, voices shouting in Greek, Hebrew, Coptic, and Latin. It was a city of crossroads, not just of trade, but of ideas. Here, philosophies met and merged, each borrowing, reshaping, and fusing with the others, until something entirely new was born. The Jewish community thrived, translating scripture into Greek in what became known as the Septuagint, while Greek philosophers debated Plato beneath colonnades, and Egyptian priests carried their rituals of Isis and Osiris through incense-filled temples. It was in this swirl of languages and beliefs that Christianity first set down roots. Early Christians in Alexandria were not living in isolation. They heard the chants of the Isis cult echoing across the city. They saw the processions where statues of gods were carried through the streets. Mourning turned to joy as the myth of Osiris's resurrection was retold. They also sat in synagogues where the Torah was read aloud, blending ancient Hebrew faith with Greek translation. And above it all, philosophers argued about logos, the divine word or reason that held the universe together. Into this world came the gospel, and suddenly the lines between traditions began to blur. What if someone wrote a text in this city that joined them all together? A gospel not simply retelling the life of Christ, but casting it in the form of the Osiris myth. Christ betrayed like Osiris, laid in a tomb like Osiris, mourned by devoted women like Isis, and raised again in glory. For the Alexandrian mind, this would not seem foreign. It would be proof that the pattern of death and rebirth found in Egypt was being fulfilled in a man of flesh and blood. The myth became history, and history became salvation. Fragments of this fusion survive in whispers. The Gospel of John, written in Greek, speaks of the Logos made flesh, a concept straight out of Platonic philosophy. Early Christian hymns in Egypt describe Christ as the one who conquers death and reigns eternal, echoing the titles once given to Osiris. Some scholars even suspect that certain Gnostic Gospels, texts banned and buried by the Church, carried traces of Egyptian ritual language hidden in their verses. These were not inventions from thin air. They were born in Alexandria, a city where no idea existed alone. The Vatican today guards many papyri from that era, fragments too fragile to display, too controversial to discuss. If a Gospel of Osiris once existed, this is where it was likely written, where the river of Egyptian myth met the sea of Christian faith. To admit such a text would be to admit that the Gospel did not descend untouched from heaven, but grew in the soil of many traditions. That Christ's story was not only divine, but deeply human, woven from the oldest hopes of humanity. In Alexandria, Osiris and the Gospel may have kissed, and their embrace still lingers in the shadows of the church. We all know the image. The Library of Alexandria, engulfed in flames, scrolls curling into ash, knowledge lost forever. It is the tragedy every history book repeats, the symbol of how fragile memory can be. But the truth is more complicated. The library did not vanish in a single night of fire. It faded over centuries, sacked and looted again and again, its treasures scattered rather than entirely destroyed. And in that scattering, something survived. For when walls burn, people run. And when scribes run, they carry with them what matters most. Legends speak of one such scribe, a nameless figure who refused to let the story of Osiris and the new Christian gospel die in the smoke. He had spent his life copying texts, combining fragments, weaving Egyptian ritual with Greek philosophy and Jewish prophecy. What he carried was not a single scroll, but a composite, a stitched-together manuscript he called the Book of Rising. It was not Egyptian, not Christian, but something in between, a text that claimed to show the hidden roots of resurrection. The story goes that as the flames climbed the shelves and the city shook with chaos, this scribe slipped into the night with a sealed tube under his arm. He boarded a ship in the harbour, blending with merchants and refugees, sailing westward across the Mediterranean. Some say he landed in Crete, others that he went on to Rome, where he hid the text among a community of believers who whispered of both Osiris and Christ as one. What might have been in this Book of Rising? Imagine a gospel that begins with the drowning of Osiris, shifts seamlessly to the crucifixion of Christ, and ends with both enthroned as rulers of eternity. Imagine verses that show Isis mourning beside Mary, both mothers of resurrection, both keepers of divine blood. To those who read it, it would not feel heretical but complete, as if two halves of a pattern had finally been joined. Centuries later, faint references to such a text appear in odd places. A Coptic hymn mentioning a scroll that spoke of the Lord of the Nile rising as the Lord of Jerusalem. A medieval inventory describing a papyrus written in red and black ink, stored with other apocrypha. Even a Renaissance note from a Vatican scholar who complained of a manuscript that confused Christ with an Egyptian king. Each reference is small, scattered, but together they suggest that the scribe's secret did not vanish. It slipped into hidden collections, waiting for safer times that never came. Today, when historians talk about the Library of Alexandria, they tell us what was lost. But perhaps the more dangerous question is what was saved. Because if even one scroll survived the ashes, carried by one determined scribe, then the story of resurrection may not belong solely to the Gospels. It may have been preserved in a composite text, a book of rising that crossed the sea and still lingers somewhere in the shadows of Rome. Walk the streets of Rome in the 1st century. The city hums with life, merchants calling out, chariots rattling, and the scent of the Tiber thick in the air. Among the temples of Jupiter and Mars, hidden in plain sight, are shrines to Isis, the goddess with the throne-shaped crown, the mother who nurtures, protects, and resurrects. Her cult is not just Egyptian, it is Roman, adapted, embraced, whispered among citizens who crave connection to mystery, magic, and immortality. People light lamps at her altars, sing her hymns, and believe that by honoring her, they touch the divine. Isis becomes everywhere, her imagery infiltrating coins, mosaics, and statues. Her head crowned with a solar disk flanked by horns, her figure draped in flowing robes, sometimes holding an infant who radiates divinity. In this iconography, there is both comfort and authority. She is the mother of kings and gods alike, a figure who bridges heaven and earth. The Romans, practical and spiritual at once, accept her presence because she brings order and protection, not rebellion. Yet beneath the surface, her cult carries secrets, rituals that speak of resurrection, judgment, and eternal life. Fast forward several centuries. The Roman Empire has shifted. Pagan temples are closed, statues toppled, and Christianity emerges as the official faith. But the symbols of Isis do not vanish. They transform. Mary appears in art, cloaked in blue, standing under a crescent moon or adorned with stars. The throne crown of Isis becomes the halo of Mary. The nurturing mother, who holds a child echoing divine power, carries forward. Only now her story is wrapped in a new faith. The connections are subtle, deliberate, or perhaps accidental. Scholars argue endlessly over whether the Marian starry crown is coincidence, syncretism, or a conscious strategy by early Christians to integrate popular pagan devotion. In churches across Italy and France, paintings show Mary with 12 stars surrounding her, referencing the vision in Revelation. Yet anyone with knowledge of Egyptian cults sees echoes of Isis. Both figures embody motherhood, resurrection, and protection. Both are intermediaries between the human and divine. Both command devotion that transcends social class and literacy. Whether the Christian artists understood the full depth of what they were borrowing or simply sought to make conversion easier, the imagery carries weight, meaning, and continuity. When you look closely at these paintings, mosaics, and frescoes, you see a lineage of iconography spanning centuries and continents. The Mother with Stars is not just Mary. She is Isis reborn, translated into Christian faith, carrying memory, power, and mystery forward. The cults may have shifted names, but the essence survives. And in that survival lies a whisper of secret knowledge, an echo of a book lost and carried, of a story preserved across rivers, empires, and faiths. Every blue robe, every crown of stars, every gesture of a mother cradling divinity is a hint of what once was and what endured. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of Rome in the year 1637. The city is alive with the clatter of hooves, the voices of merchants, and the scent of incense drifting from churches. Behind heavy doors in a Jesuit college, Athanasius Kircher, a man of impossible curiosity, pores over ancient scripts. He has dedicated his life to understanding Egypt, to deciphering hieroglyphs, to unlocking secrets the world believes lost. His cabinet is crowded with talismans, strange artifacts, and manuscripts that have travelled centuries, continents, and empires. Kircher's hands are stained with ink as he copies symbols, rearranges letters, and annotates his translations in margins that spiral with thought. Some notes are meticulous, others wild with speculation. He believes the world contains a hidden order, a language connecting gods and men, past and present. And among his scribbled notations, in a corner of a fragile folio, he writes a curious phrase: Liber Osiris, the Book of Osiris. He does not explain much, a reference veiled in Latin shorthand that only he could decipher. Scholars centuries later would puzzle over what it could mean, whether it was myth, misdirection, or a genuine text. The Jesuit collects tirelessly. Objects arrive from Alexandria, from Cairo, from Mediterranean ports, shipped by merchants who do not understand their significance. Golden amulets, jars painted with gods, papyri that smell of sand and salt, and occasionally a fragment of a text too small to read but powerful in suggestion. Every piece sparks a new theory. Every artifact hints at a story, a history, a gospel older than Rome itself. He dreams of a book that unites the myth of Osiris with truths lost to time, a narrative that could illuminate creation, death, and resurrection in ways the Church does not yet understand. Rumours swirl even in his lifetime. Some whisper that Kircher has found proof that Egyptian teachings prefigure the Christian story, that there are connections hidden in plain sight. Others call him eccentric, obsessive, dangerous. And then the Liber Osiridis itself disappears. Filed in an archive with other Jesuit manuscripts, it is referenced briefly, then never again. Scholars claim misplacement, fire, or simple error, but those who study his notes suspect something more. Perhaps it was removed deliberately, a work too dangerous, too revealing for the world. Perhaps it contained secrets of death and resurrection, of life after loss, of knowledge the powerful would rather forget. The cabinet remains, a labyrinth of wonder. Modern visitors see glass cases, dusted shelves, and labels in Latin and Italian. Yet Kircher's influence persists. His drawings echo in libraries and museums. His attempts to bridge cultures, to understand the divine through the symbols of ancient Egypt, leave a trace. And somewhere, hidden in the margins, in the folds of a manuscript, the Liber Osiridis whispers still, waiting for eyes curious enough, brave enough, to follow its thread into the light. Look up in the centre of street, Peter's Square, and you see it, a towering Egyptian obelisk standing over 4,000 years of history, carried from Heliopolis to Rome, raised in the heart of Christianity in the year 1560. Its shadow stretches across the piazza as the sun passes overhead, a silent witness to centuries of power, ceremony, and devotion. At noon, the shadow aligns with markers hidden in the paving stones, invisible to most but designed with intention. The architects of the square were not merely building a stage for religious display. They were creating a cosmogram, a map of heaven and earth, a geometry of control that spoke in angles and light. The obelisk itself is more than stone. It is a needle-piercing time, linking Rome to the Nile, to the pharaohs, and to gods older than the apostles. Scholars and esoteric researchers have noticed subtle alignments. The obelisk points to the Vatican's meridian line, a silent conductor of solar power that measures equinoxes and solstices. During the summer solstice, sunlight glances along its edge and falls upon a hidden marker near the steps of the basilica. The pattern repeats in winter, creating a rhythm of shadow and light that no casual visitor notices. Some claim the positioning is symbolic, a reminder that Rome sits at the centre of spiritual and earthly authority. Others suggest something deeper, that the needle channels energies ancient Egyptians understood, energies that link kingship, resurrection, and sacred knowledge. Walk the square early in the morning and watch the light creep along the stone, stretching shadows across the cobbles. Knights, popes, and pilgrims have crossed these same stones for centuries, unaware that each step falls within a carefully orchestrated pattern. Coins tossed into fountains, candles lit at altars, even the placement of obelisks and statues follows lines that mirror the heavens. Architecture becomes scripture, and geometry becomes devotion. Some historians point out that the obelisk once bore inscriptions in hieroglyphs that predate Rome, that they spoke of sun cycles, divine kingship, and life beyond death. In the 15th century, Pope Sixtus V moved it from its original location in the Circus of Nero to its current site, an enormous engineering feat that required teams of men, ropes, and cranes over months. Why such effort? Beyond demonstrating papal power, it may have been to preserve the obelisk as a living signal, a monument not just of stone, but of hidden meaning. The square itself frames the basilica like a stage, with colonnades curving outward like arms embracing visitors. Walk from the edges to the centre and notice the effect. Perspective shifts, angles sharpen, and suddenly the obelisk commands attention. Scholars have debated whether its placement aligns with certain churches across Rome, creating invisible lines of sight that form a cosmic lattice. Each line, each angle, each shadow is part of a message, a hidden dialogue between Egypt and Rome, between the old gods and the new faith. The obelisk's shadow falls across centuries, unchanging, silent, and yet speaking. It reminds anyone who studies it that power can be communicated not only through words or weapons, but through geometry, light, and placement. Rome's centre is a stage, the obelisk its pointer, and those who know how to read the shadows can glimpse a story written in stone, a story older than the Vatican itself. Look closely at a jed pillar, and you see more than a simple column. This ancient Egyptian symbol represents the spine of Osiris, the god who died, was dismembered, and rose again. Each horizontal line marks stability, endurance, and the link between heaven and earth. It is a guide for souls, a ladder for resurrection, a message that life persists beyond death. Now, look at a Christian cross. Upright wood, intersected by a single beam, the method of execution that transformed into a symbol of eternal life. Two trees of life, one of bone and one of wood, separated by centuries and continents, yet whispering the same story. In the temples of Thebes, priests chanted hymns to Osiris, invoking the jed during funerary rites. The column was often painted green, the colour of rebirth, of crops and Nile floods that brought life to Egypt. Every festival, every procession, every ritual reinforced the spine as a link between the earthly and divine. Centuries later, in small churches across Judea and Rome, Christians painted the cross above altars. The crucifixion became a ladder, not just a punishment, but a bridge for salvation. Worshippers did not see it consciously, but the symbolism echoed older wisdom: bone and wood, death and resurrection, the spine and the cross, all telling the same tale in different tongues. Some scholars suggest that early Christian missionaries borrowed freely from Egyptian imagery. In Alexandria and along the Mediterranean coast, Greek, Jewish, and Egyptian ideas braided together like vines. The jed became subtly encoded in carvings, frescoes, and texts. Crosses appeared where columns once stood. The shapes mirrored one another. The stories, though clothed in different theology, carried the same heartbeat, a journey from mortality to eternal life. Walk into a Baroque church in Rome and look at the pulpit. Notice the columns, often adorned with subtle notches and bands. See the chandeliers and carvings. Some appear purely decorative, yet they follow proportions reminiscent of the jed. Some cryptographers and esoteric historians argue these are not coincidences, but deliberate gestures. Priests and architects knew symbols endure when words fade. They placed them in stone, in wood, and in paint, knowing the faithful would sense meaning even if they could not name it. The jed and the cross both speak to stability under pressure, resurrection, and the ascent of the soul. One represents the backbone of a god who taught immortality through suffering. The other represents the wood of a man who conquered death by embracing it. Side by side in memory, the two pillars form a silent dialogue, a continuum of human understanding about life, death, and the hope of return. They are reminders that wisdom migrates, that symbols transcend culture, and that the story of ascent is older than Christianity, older than Rome, and older than the stones that now frame the Vatican itself. Step into the desert of Egypt, where the sun bleaches sand and the wind carries the stories of centuries. Monasteries cling to rocky cliffs, humble stone sanctuaries where men and women sought closeness to God. The Desert Fathers lived lives of silence, prayer, and endurance. They embraced solitude, not as punishment, but as a pathway to illumination. In these monasteries, the air trembled with chants, low voices rising and falling like waves, calling the soul toward heaven. The Copts preserved traditions older than Rome, blending Christian belief with echoes of Egypt's ancient religion. Their hymns, sung in Coptic and Greek, carried a resonance that scholars say could have hidden traces of Assyrian thought. Some verses hinted at death and return, at the body scattered yet whole again, at a light emerging from shadow. These themes mirrored the story of Osiris, whose murder and reassembly by Isis promised renewal and eternal life. The Desert Fathers may not have known they were weaving the same cosmic tapestry that Egyptian priests sang centuries earlier, yet the pattern is undeniable. Walk past a monastery's heavy wooden door, and the scent of incense hits your nose, mingled with desert dust. Inside, the walls are painted with saints, angels, and mysterious symbols. Some Coptic crosses appear alongside faint hieroglyphic motifs. Some art historians speculate these are not merely decorative. They are a bridge, a whisper of continuity, a hidden lineage of ideas that refuse to die. A bilingual hymn survives in fragments, cited in the writings of a monk from the 5th century, speaking of a figure who descends into darkness and rises again. The language shifts between Egyptian and early Greek, as if the words themselves carried the knowledge of two worlds. The rhythm of the chant, slow and deliberate, mirrors the ebb and flow of the Nile, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Each syllable resonates through stone corridors, shaking dust from ancient rafters. Pilgrims and novices alike reported a sense of awe, an almost hypnotic awareness that something older than Christianity itself whispered behind the words. It is easy to dismiss these connections as coincidence, yet the persistence of the themes across centuries suggests something deliberate, a hidden curriculum of resurrection passed from Egypt into the Christian heart. Some researchers argue the Copts were custodians, protectors of a knowledge that could not be spoken aloud. The desert became a laboratory of spirit, a vault where the essence of Osiris survived under Christian guise. In the chants, the rhythm, the gestures of prayer, there is a hint that the ancient God and the risen Christ share the same melody, that life and death, bone and soul, sand and spirit are braided together. The desert fire, the burning sun above, the wind in the rocks, all seem to witness this eternal hymn. It is a song of endurance, of hidden truth, and of hope carried across time, waiting for those who listen to hear the rise of the soul anew. In the heart of Alexandria, beneath the bustling streets and the harbour's distant cries, there lies a labyrinth carved from stone. The Serapeum, once the great sanctuary of Serapis, god of life and death, held massive bulls of stone, each resting, as if asleep yet guarding secrets older than the city itself. Scholars in the early 19th century discovered fragments of maps hinting at tunnels, hidden chambers, and passages that could swallow a man whole. One fragment in particular suggested that a Christian scribe, fleeing persecution, may have ventured into these galleries to conceal sacred papyri. Imagine walking along narrow corridors, torchlight flickering across carved reliefs of bulls, serpents, and Egyptian gods. The walls echo with whispers, the faint resonance of chants long forgotten. This scribe, historian legends tell us, carried a manuscript that merged the resurrection myths of Osiris with the teachings of the early church. He knew that to preserve this knowledge, it could not remain above ground, vulnerable to burning or confiscation. So, he descended into the catacombs, guided by the shadows of the Serapeum's sleeping guardians. Each chamber he passed was a testament to power and devotion. Massive blocks of stone bore inscriptions warning intruders. Some spoke of the bull as intermediary between heaven and earth, while others hinted at life after death and the triumph of the spirit. To a casual observer, the carvings might appear decorative or ceremonial. To a careful eye, they formed a network of signs, guiding the scribe toward the perfect hiding place. And there, beneath a bull whose eyes seemed almost alive in torchlight, he buried his scrolls. The map fragment, now preserved in a dusty collection of late 19th century manuscripts, offers tantalizing clues. Lines drawn in red ink trace corridors that no longer exist. Annotations mark secret doors and false walls. There are references to celestial alignments, suggesting the scribe timed his burial to the stars. The scrolls themselves, if they survive, would reveal a gospel unknown to history, a text that bridges Egypt and early Christianity, the Nile and the Mediterranean, life and death, man and God. Archaeologists have debated the Serapeum's tunnels for decades. Some argue that the legend of the hidden papyri is simply myth, a story constructed to give meaning to a ruined temple. Others insist that the precision of the map, the unusual placement of stones, and hints in early Christian texts suggest a deliberate effort to hide something extraordinary. The corridors remain largely unexplored, partially collapsed, yet still whisper of secrets beneath Alexandria's streets. To stand at the threshold of the Serapeum is to feel time compress. The scribe's footsteps echo in your mind, the bull's silent gaze weighing on you. Every stone, every carving, every fragment of a map points to a history that was meant to disappear, yet persists in shadow. It is a tale of courage, faith, and the desperate preservation of knowledge that could have reshaped Christianity itself. Somewhere in that labyrinth, beneath stone and sand, the whispers wait for those willing to follow the hidden path. The sun had barely risen over the Nile when Brother Arnian slipped through the narrow alleyways of Alexandria, a small cylindrical tube clutched tightly to his chest. The air was thick with the scent of spices, river mud, and the chatter of merchants preparing their stalls. He knew the eyes watching him were not ordinary. Pagan priests, loyal to the Serapeum, had caught wind of his intentions, and imperial officials who feared any Christian subversion were close behind. Every step had to be measured, every breath silent, because discovery meant death, or worse, the destruction of the sacred contents he carried. The tube contained scrolls, carefully rolled and sealed, with wax bearing the emblem of the falcon, a symbol of protection and vigilance. These scrolls told a story older than Rome itself, connecting the resurrection of Osiris with the teachings of the early followers of Christ. To deliver them safely to Ostia, where they would be hidden until a monastery in the hills could receive them, was a mission that demanded cunning, courage, and faith. Annian slipped onto a grain ship waiting quietly at the harbour, its hull heavy with sacks of wheat destined for Rome. The ship smelled of salt and damp wood, and the creaking of ropes was almost louder than the chatter of the crew. He blended with dockhands, adopting the gait and mannerisms of one accustomed to hard labour, while his heart pounded with the rhythm of fear and hope. Every shadow seemed to hide a hunter, every ripple in the water a warning of imminent capture. As the ship pushed away from the docks, Annian peered back at the city he had loved and feared. Alexandria spread like a jewel against the morning sun, its obelisks and temples bathed in gold, yet none of its beauty could mask the danger he had left behind. He unrolled the tube slightly to ensure the scrolls were secure. The wax seals remained intact, and the ink had not smudged despite the Nile's humidity. These were the lifeline of knowledge, the fragile thread connecting past and future, Egypt and Rome. The journey along the Mediterranean was slow, the wind gentle but unsteady. Annian spent hours atop the deck, scanning the horizon for sails that might bear hostile intent. By night, he slept little, crouched near the mast, listening to the groan of timber and the whisper of waves. He imagined the scroll's words, the secrets contained in fragile fibres, surviving despite empires, fire, and time. They were more than words. They were hope, a bridge between civilizations, a coded memory of gods and men intertwined. When the ship finally approached Ostia, the port brimming with traders and officials, Annian's pulse quickened again. Every step onto the crowded docks was a potential exposure, yet he moved with purpose, guided by the promise of a safe harbour. Somewhere, in the labyrinthine alleys of Rome, the scrolls would find sanctuary. Somewhere, the story of resurrection and rising would survive, waiting for the next keeper, who understood the weight of history and the urgency of secrets that could not be lost. The air inside the titulous church was thick with incense and tension. Candlelight flickered across the faces of bishops gathered around a simple wooden table, their robes catching the glow like halos of cautious intent. Before them lay the scroll, unrolled just enough to reveal cryptic symbols and archaic letters that shimmered as though alive. The text seemed impossible, almost heretical, for it hinted at knowledge older than Moses himself, linking the resurrection story with traditions long forgotten, a bridge from Egypt to Judea, from Osiris to Christ. Bishop Lucian, a tall man with a keen eye, broke the silence first. He spoke of the beauty, of the intelligence behind the writing, the way the words seemed to pulse with life. He warned that destruction might erase something sacred, something that could illuminate the faith rather than threaten it. Yet, across the table, Bishop Antonius shook his head. He feared the implications, that if the scroll became known, lay people would question scripture, might even challenge the authority of Rome itself. The debate stretched hours into the flickering night. Scholars and scribes whispered quietly at the edges, offering notes, referencing older works, while the bishops weighed their consciences against the stability of the church. The text spoke of life, death, and rebirth, weaving Egyptian motifs with Christian teachings in ways no one had seen before. It suggested that the story of Christ had roots deeper, older, intertwined with mysteries from the Nile that predated Sinai. Finally, the decision came. The scroll would not be destroyed. Its power was too great, its wisdom too fragile to risk burning. But it could not be left unguarded either. The bishops performed the first sealing, carefully rolling the scroll, binding it with wax imprinted with the chi-rho, and locking it within a chest of cedar and iron. Only a few trusted priests would know its location, and even they would be sworn to silence. The text was no longer merely a document. It became a living secret, a relic of knowledge hidden from the world, preserved in shadows. Lucian and Antonius both knew that history would never record this night. Centuries might pass without a hint that the gospel had been rewritten in secret, that the ancient wisdom of Osiris had been folded into the heart of Christianity and hidden away. Yet in that silence, the scroll lived, waiting for another guardian, another monk or bishop brave enough to preserve its truth. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the treasure locked behind stone and candlelight. The first sealing was complete, a promise that the secret of resurrection, older than Moses, would endure, carried through time by the hands of those who dared to protect it. The roads of the Crusades were long, dusty, and dangerous, stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the heart of the Holy Land. Knights in white mantles with the Red Cross rode in silence, their horses' hooves echoing off stone streets and desert sands. They carried armor, swords, and secrets. Among these secrets were texts, objects, and relics that no ordinary pilgrim could imagine. One such treasure, some whispered, was a copy of the ancient scroll that connected the story of Osiris to the early gospel, a document that could change everything if read aloud. Nile traders, with their caravans loaded with papyrus, spices, and precious metals, became unlikely couriers. They moved quietly under the sun, past camels and merchants, blending commerce with caution. Some Templars understood the power of these scrolls, and arranged for copies to be smuggled north, hidden within bundles of trade goods. The journey was perilous, with bandits, rival orders, and political spies constantly in pursuit. Yet the Templars were relentless. Their code demanded vigilance and secrecy, and no hint of the true cargo could escape. Once the scrolls reached Europe, they were not openly displayed. Instead, they were catalogued under ambiguous titles, sometimes as heresy, sometimes as property of the church, hidden in monastery vaults and private collections. The Red Crossed Order was careful, using cryptic symbols in the margins to mark authenticity and ownership. Bees, stars, and intertwined lines hinted at origin, lineage, and allegiance. To an ordinary reader, the annotations seemed decorative, mysterious, or meaningless. To an initiated few, they were a map, a key, and a warning. Templar libraries became repositories of this hidden knowledge, and the monks and knights who guarded them understood that the scrolls were more than history. They contained coded theology, mystical geometry, and stories older than Rome. Every illustration, every symbol, every margin note was deliberate, carrying instructions for the initiated to follow across lands, through monasteries, and along trade routes. The texts whispered that the resurrection story was layered, that life, death, and rebirth had been taught in Egypt centuries before the Christos walked Galilee. When the Templar order was disbanded in the early 14th century, these documents did not vanish. They were quietly absorbed by Rome, scattered among libraries, or buried in secret chambers. Later, during inquisitions, the same scrolls were cited as heretical, yet never fully destroyed. Somewhere, behind locked doors and hidden niches, the legacy of Osiris and Christ travelled together, preserved in shadow. And as the river of symbols flowed, winding from Nile to Tiber, it carried with it a silent story of protection, secrecy, and faith that would outlast empires, knights, and centuries. Across Europe, from the misty hills of Poland to the sunlit valleys of southern France, statues of the Madonna appear with faces darkened, some as black as midnight, some tinged with bronze or soot. At first glance, one might assume age, fire damage, or dirt. But to those who look closer, each dark Madonna seems to carry a secret, a hidden lineage of ideas older than the churches that now house them. The Black Madonna is not merely a figure of piety. She is a symbol, a shadow of something lost yet preserved, echoing the maternal archetypes of Egypt, particularly Isis, who nurtured and resurrected Osiris. In the village of Czestochowa, pilgrims kneel before a Madonna whose skin is blackened. Legends speak of miraculous protection during wars, invaders' bullets bouncing harmlessly off the wooden surface, and the faithful finding guidance in her gaze. Scholars have debated why these statues are dark. Some insist it is soot from centuries of candles, others chalk it up to pigment choices. Yet, a pattern emerges across Europe. Every dark Madonna occupies a sacred site linked to older pre-Christian rites. Many are located in caves, on hilltops, or at river crossings, echoing places where Isis or other mother goddesses might have been worshipped. Marian iconography often shows her draped in blue, a colour that recalls the night sky and the waters of the Nile. Her gaze is solemn, her hands holding a child, sometimes a vessel, a book, or a scroll. These details are not random. They suggest continuity, a deliberate bridging of traditions. The priests who later banned her cult could not erase her entirely. She persisted in shadows, in whispers, and in local customs. Communities maintained secret festivals, offerings, and rituals that aligned with the cycles of the sun and the moon, echoing Osirian resurrection mysteries in a Christian guise. The Black Madonna's spread is uncanny. In France, the sanctuary of Montserrat draws thousands who climb the mountain paths to seek her blessing. In Italy, the Madonna of Loreto carries similar characteristics, while in Spain, Catalonia and Aragon host multiple dark Madonnas that share pose, expression, and iconography. Historians and folklorists suggest a transmission through trade routes, pilgrimages, and monastic networks. The symbolism survives because it was encoded in the very objects themselves, waiting for eyes attuned to notice. Some researchers argue the Black Madonna represents more than maternal protection. She is a memory, a vessel of suppressed knowledge. Her darkened skin is a visual code for resilience, secrecy, and continuity. She embodies the convergence of Egyptian, Greek, and Christian traditions, a living relic of ideas that could not be extinguished. As pilgrims kneel, as candles flicker, and shadows stretch across stone walls, she silently reminds observers that some legacies endure not by conquest, law, or doctrine, but by being quietly remembered, carried from generation to generation, hidden in plain sight. In the year 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte led his expedition to Egypt, bringing scholars, soldiers, and curiosity seekers to the banks of the Nile. They carried with them not just muskets and maps, but a hunger for knowledge, for treasures hidden under centuries of sand and secrecy. When they returned to France, the spoils were more than gold or stone. Obelisks were shipped to Paris, filling the Tuileries with sharp points of light, their inscriptions hinting at rituals and kings long dead. And in the corners of museums, crates labelled sarcophagi and papyrus disappeared into storage, catalogued partially, mysteriously, and sometimes not at all. A ledger kept by one of the curators notes a strange acquisition, a sarcophagus labelled with the name of a minor priest of Thebes. With it came a papyrus, unlisted in any inventory, a document described only as a book of rising. The ledger abruptly goes blank after the entry. No notes, no follow-up, no mention of the papyrus in later records. Scholars who visited decades later found only a cold case, whispers among archivists, and a faint scent of ink and papyrus in a locked room. The disappearance seemed deliberate, as if someone decided the knowledge was too dangerous to keep in a ledger or display publicly. Napoleon himself was fascinated by Egypt beyond conquest. He saw in the pyramids and temples not only military triumph, but legitimacy, a symbolic bridge between his ambition and the ancient kings. He ordered golden bees sewn into coronation robes and engraved onto banners. The bee, a tiny insect carrying immense significance in Egyptian lore, represented eternal kingship, resurrection, and divine order. In many ways, it echoed Osiris, the god of life and death, whose resurrection myth had quietly inspired so much of Europe's secret history. Napoleon may have understood this. His bees were not merely decorative. They were a statement, a claim, a whisper of continuity linking him to a sacred past. Meanwhile, in Rome, stones once silent began to speak in subtle ways. Obelisks erected in piazzas aligned with cardinal points, their shadows marking solstices. Churches built near them seemed to echo in pattern, in geometry, in light, as if the memory of Osiris and the Nile had seeped into mortar and marble. Scholars have noted that some of the stones moved during Napoleon's occupation contain faint carvings, symbols later attributed to early Egyptian Christian syncretism. A line of ink on a forgotten ledger, the placement of a single obelisk, and the embroidery on an emperor's robe together hint at knowledge preserved, transmitted, and yet carefully concealed. The unlisted papyrus remains missing. Some claim it was stolen, others suggest it was intentionally hidden within a private collection. Regardless, the story persists. Napoleon's bees, Rome's stones, and that blank ledger page form a silent triangle, a message encoded in empire, architecture, and ambition. The past was never erased. It was borrowed, copied, and hidden, waiting for the eyes who could see the code between the lines. The Vatican's Gregorian Egyptian Museum is quiet, filled with the scent of polished stone and old wood, the air carrying whispers of centuries. Visitors move in hushed reverence, eyes drawn to scarabs, ankhs, and finely painted coffins that once cradled mummies beneath the Nile Sunday. Each display is immaculate, every artifact catalogued and explained with precise labels. Yet some scholars have noticed something curious, something almost imperceptible, a gap in the inventory, a missing accession number, as if the record itself wanted to hide a story. In one corner, a collection of funerary papyri lies behind glass, small and yellowed, the hieroglyphs intricate and alive with ritual and myth. Many are typical, prayers for the dead, spells to guide souls to the afterlife, but some contain strange passages that defy classification. Lines about rising from death, the union of divine and human blood, and names that echo both Egyptian gods and obscure Christian figures. These pages are catalogued as funerary, ordinary, not dangerous, not worth a second glance. But some researchers whisper that in plain sight, hidden under the label of common burial rites, might be a gospel unlike any other, one that blends the story of Osiris with early Christian charisma. The museum was opened in 1876 by Pope Pius IX, intended to preserve Egypt's treasures for the faithful and the curious alike. The rooms are arranged to guide visitors through dynasties, temples, and tombs. Yet, if you know where to look, you can see hints of something else. A sarcophagus with unusual iconography, a statuette of Isis holding a child in a pose, strikingly similar to later Marian depictions, a scroll folded and tucked behind a cabinet. The catalogue does not mention it. The accession number is absent. The presence of these items raises questions about intent and secrecy. Archivists who have studied the collection note repeated patterns. Objects that should have been listed simply disappear, reappear under vague titles, or are described in a single line in Latin that translates roughly to miscellaneous funerary. The lack of clarity seems deliberate, a protective measure that preserves knowledge while keeping it inaccessible. One can imagine a priest centuries ago carrying a papyrus across the Mediterranean, carefully placing it within these rooms, knowing it would survive, yet no one would recognize it for what it truly was. Walking through the museum today, it is easy to feel the weight of history. Each scarab glimmers like a secret, each ankh speaks in silence. The missing accession number is a gap in paper, but a bridge to possibility. Somewhere among these stones, statues, and scrolls, the lost gospel may be waiting, disguised, misunderstood, and yet preserved. It is a reminder that in places of devotion, in rooms of knowledge, truth can hide in plain sight. Imagine a story not told in words, but in cycles, a rhythm older than any scroll. The lost gospel, if it existed, did not read like the texts we know. It was not organized in chapters, nor was it framed in linear time. Instead, it moved like the Nile, circling and returning, mirroring the myth of Osiris in each act of passion. There is the dismemberment, the moment of rupture, when a body, sacred and divine, is scattered across the world. In this phase, betrayal and violence meet, not merely as punishment, but as transformation, a fracture that holds the seeds of restoration. After the shattering, there comes vigil. Silence stretches across the narrative like a desert night. Here the mourners gather, the faithful and the unseen, to watch, to wait. The darkness is long, a tension that hangs over the river of story, holding hope in suspension. It is not passive, vigil is active remembrance, the silent labour of those who know that what is lost can be found. In the context of the Osirian cycle, it is the work of Isis, of careful hands and whispered prayers, collecting fragments, stitching them together in secret. Remembering follows, the body made whole again, not merely restored, but transformed. Each piece finds its place, each wound sealed by devotion and ritual. The narrative flows through this act as if the author were tracing the patterns of stars, the rotation of the sun, and the rise of the river after floods. The reassembled figure becomes emblem, teaching not just survival, but the sacred truth of continuity, of life persisting beyond the grip of destruction. Then comes enthronement. The figure ascends, not by force of armies or decree, but by recognition of hidden authority. It is a quiet coronation, a lifting that validates the cycle itself, the rhythm that has been kept alive in shadows and underfoot. It echoes across generations, in ritual, symbol, and the hidden liturgy of secret worship. Enthronement is a moment both of arrival and of preparation, for the next phase must follow, as the Osirian myth insists. Finally, dawn. Light stretches over the landscape, illuminating patterns and truths invisible in darkness. The cycle closes not in an ending, but in renewal. The contour of the lost gospel, imagined this way, is circular, cyclical, sacredly timed. It teaches that story is not always linear, that revelation can be encoded in shape and rhythm, in vigil and restoration, in the quiet triumphs that history almost forgot. To imagine this gospel is to see narrative as geometry, as living pulse, a shape that lifts the sacred from obscurity, carries it across centuries, and invites those who watch closely to follow, to remember, and to recognize a pattern older than Rome, older than Christendom, older even than the Nile itself. Symbols are more than decoration. They are languages older than words, messages etched in stone and painted on walls, signs that travel across time in shapes. Look at the Ankh, the Egyptian key of life, held in the hands of pharaohs and gods alike. It curves, a loop above a cross, simple yet profound. To the people of the Nile, it was not metaphor, but power, a declaration that life flows through the body, through breath, and through the unseen currents connecting heaven and earth. In that small loop was the secret that death need not be final, that life continues in cycles, in memory, in ritual. Now look at the Cairo, the first letters of Christ in Greek, superimposed in early Christian inscriptions. A cross forms at the center, a line vertical, a line horizontal, a fusion of word and presence. Here is life declared, not as symbol of the sun god, but of a man called the Logos, the Word made flesh. To the untrained eye, it is merely an emblem, a monogram on a tomb, a banner, a coin. But for those who knew, it was a code, a whisper, a promise of resurrection. Place them side by side, and the parallels become undeniable. The Ankh breathes, the Cairo speaks. One declares the power of life in motion, the other proclaims the power of life in story. The Egyptian key and the Christian monogram converge, two alphabets telling the same story of survival, renewal, and triumph over the finality of death. One flows from the Nile, one from Galilee, yet both meet at a single truth. Life can rise where it was thought lost. Throughout Europe, these symbols persisted. Ankhs survive on papyrus fragments, carried from Alexandria to monasteries in France. Chiros adorn catacombs and frescoes, often coexisting with other motifs of life and eternity. When the early church forbade pagan rituals, it could not fully erase the power of form, the memory of shape. The Ankh found refuge in crosses and icons, in gestures and hand positions that mimic its looped form. In this subtle survival, the language endured, hidden in plain sight. For centuries they whispered together, unrecognized by many but felt by those who watched carefully. The sacred alphabets are a cipher for continuity, a demonstration that ideas of life, death, and resurrection are universal. Breath and word, life and logos, two alphabets spelling the same rescue, two rivers converging into the same ocean. When you spot them today, in a museum, in a cathedral, or in a dusty manuscript, remember that their meaning is not just historical, it is alive. It connects you to millennia of belief, devotion, and secret knowledge, a coded message from the ancestors that life, even hidden life, always finds a way. In the quiet halls of the Vatican, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum cast a shadow not of destruction, but of restraint. Books were not burned, at least not always. They were chained, catalogued, and given labels that softened their danger. Apocryphon, curiosum, non expedit. These were words meant to protect the faithful, to warn them, to imply that some knowledge was too sharp, too seductive for the ordinary reader. Among these files was one that stood out, though its name was hidden behind layers of euphemism. It was rumoured to contain passages that linked the gospel to ancient Egyptian rites, a breath of heresy that was both beautiful and frightening. Archivists spoke in hushed tones about the document, calling it simply the File of Rising, or sometimes the Scroll of Shadows. It was never displayed, never referenced in official sermons, yet it moved through the ecclesiastical network like a ghost, appearing in inventories for a century before vanishing again. Its pages were said to be filled with imagery, with symbols that echoed the Ankh and the Cairo, with metaphors for life and resurrection that stretched beyond what Rome would officially recognize. To handle it was to touch a different reality, one where breath itself carried divine meaning, where the spirit could rise independent of doctrine. The reasoning behind the chains was clear to those who studied the bureaucracy. Do not destroy the beautiful heresy. To burn, it would be to destroy evidence of what the mind could conceive. To chain it, to classify it as forbidden, was to preserve it, to place it beyond casual reach while ensuring it could survive, quietly, until someone worthy or curious enough might find it. Each cataloguing decision was deliberate. Each euphemism layered intention upon intention. Apocryphon indicated mystery, curiosum suggested curiosity, non-expedit warned of moral hazard. Together, they formed a net to contain not just the book, but its power, the breath it carried, the questions it raised. Scholars who gained access reported a text that refused simplicity. It did not argue, it whispered. It did not instruct, it revealed patterns. Egyptian cycles of death and rebirth intertwined with narratives of Christ, demonstrating a continuity that the Church could not openly acknowledge. For centuries, this document remained invisible yet potent, a living testament to the persistence of ideas too dangerous to display. Its presence influenced theology, ritual, and the careful curation of other forbidden texts. The chains were not only physical, but conceptual. To this day, researchers debate whether the file still exists, hidden in some vault or misfiled under innocuous titles. Whether it is a single manuscript or a collection of fragments dispersed over centuries remains a mystery. Yet the Index of Forbidden Breath illustrates a principle. The Church understood that ideas, once created, cannot truly be destroyed. They may be restrained, they may be veiled, but their breath can linger, rising unseen through time, waiting for a curious eye to release it once more. Beneath the cobbled streets of Europe, through tunnels, basements, and hidden chambers, the Freemasons carried secrets older than their lodges. Their ritual halls gleamed with symbols borrowed from the Nile, beehives representing order, pillars representing knowledge, and glyphs whose meaning could not be spoken aloud. Initiates swore oaths, repeated words with precision, traced geometries in the air, and yet few understood why. Some whispers suggest that these practices were more than allegory, more than moral lesson. They were living encodings of a text too dangerous to exist openly. In Paris, London, and Edinburgh, lodges were arranged according to celestial and earthly alignments, their architects following invisible rivers that flowed beneath the cities themselves. These rivers were not water but metaphor, a current of memory, a line of thought carried through generations of initiates. Each ceremony repeated gestures that mimicked the death and rebirth cycles of Osiris. Each chant recalled the rising of Christ. Each symbol etched into the fabric of ritual preserved what the Church had chained and hidden. The beehive, so ordinary to a casual observer, was central. Each hexagon, each worker, each queen mirrored divine order. Freemasons were taught to see the hive as a reflection of the cosmos and the human body alike, the structure of thought and life. In a way, it was a map, a mnemonic device, a living memory palace. Those who could read it could reconstruct what had been silenced, paraphrased in gesture, song, and symbol. Every hammer strike, every floor plan, every step along the lodge floor carried meaning for those trained to interpret it. Pillars flanking the main chamber echoed the jade of Osiris, the spine of a god who had been dismembered and restored, and they echoed the cross of Christ. Each Masonic initiate walked between them, figuratively passing through death into knowledge. Lost words, the names that could not be spoken, were passed quietly, whispered in the dark, hidden in geometry, embedded in floor patterns, hidden in the thickness of ritual. They were not just teaching morality, they were preserving a narrative of rising, of breath, of resurrection, encoded in actions rather than text. Some historians suggest that the Freemasons' rituals were a river that kept the lost gospel alive, while papal chains kept the text itself silent. In lodges across Europe, encoded memory outlived prohibition. Apprentices became journeymen, journeymen became masters, and knowledge passed down silently, shielded by secrecy and repetition. The river ran beneath cities, invisible yet persistent, carrying fragments of a text that might otherwise have disappeared, a paraphrase of breath, a pattern of rising, a secret shared in shadow. And though the church never acknowledged it, and the streets above bustled with ordinary life, below the pavement, beneath the arches, that river flowed, quietly shaping minds to remember what was meant to be forgotten. In the 21st century, the desert no longer holds all secrets. Dust and papyrus have been replaced by pixels and algorithms, and suddenly, the scattered traces of the lost gospel can be gathered in ways impossible even 100 years ago. Multispectral imaging sees ink invisible to the naked eye, reveals words hidden under centuries of decay, and AIs can compare thousands of texts in seconds that once took scholars lifetimes to decipher. Hymns, funerary spells, and Christian prayers appear in patterns, sequences that hint at a shared ancestry, a story woven across cultures, languages, and centuries. Scholars upload high-resolution scans from monasteries in Egypt, chapels in southern France, and hidden libraries in Italy. Every document is fed into neural networks trained to identify anomalies, stylistic echoes, and repetitions across time. Latin texts whisper to Coptic hymns. Greek marginalia speak to demotic spells. The AI detects what humans cannot see. The same phrases mirrored in different scripts, the same arrangements of words echoing the Osirian death and rising, the same symbols repeated in subtle ways. It is as if the lost gospel never vanished, but hid in layers, waiting for digital eyes to see. Patterns begin to appear like constellations in a night sky. The AI maps the occurrences, showing alignments between ritual timing, lunar cycles, and the cadence of prayers. Some manuscripts seem mundane at first glance, yet the algorithms detect sequences matching funerary texts from Thebes with early Christian resurrection hymns. It is as though the death and rising of Osiris and the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ are not separate stories, but refracted narratives, told through the lenses of two traditions, blended into one continuum, hidden in plain sight. For researchers, the excitement is electric. Metadata links names, places, and dates, revealing that scribes travelled farther than history had recorded. Notes once thought marginalia suddenly map a path from Alexandria to Ostia, from Rome to southern Gaul. There is a sense that someone, somewhere, encoded these texts deliberately, aware that centuries later, technology would decode the network, revealing relationships invisible to the human eye. Yet with all this power comes caution. Every new connection must be verified, every anomaly checked against forgery and chance. The digital sandstorm can reveal or mislead, illuminate or deceive. Scholars tread carefully, but the thrill is undeniable. Across screens and servers, across networks and clouds, the lost gospel pulses faintly, alive in data, waiting for someone to follow the patterns fully, to understand not just the words, but the shapes, the cycles, the hidden logic. It is a resurrection of knowledge, arising not in temples or tombs, but in circuits, code, and the infinite patience of digital memory. The room smells of old paper, ink, and polished wood. Sunlight streams through tall, narrow windows, slicing the dust into golden lines. A single desk sits in the center, its surface stacked with ledgers, folders, and a small sealed envelope that hums with quiet power. The curator, a man whose face is lined with years of secrets, hesitates. In his hands is not merely a document, but centuries of tension, belief, and forbidden knowledge. The Liber Osiridis could rewrite what generations have held sacred. To open it is to unveil the river running beneath Rome's marble, a flow hidden since Alexandria burned. He turns the envelope over and over, imagining the ripple it would cause. Scholars, clergy, and historians alike would confront a truth too complex to name easily. The text does not destroy faith, yet it reframes it, bending orthodoxy toward continuity, connecting Christianity to the rhythms of ancient Egypt, showing resurrection not as a one-time event, but as part of a timeless cycle. The beauty of it calls to him, the art in its words, the elegance of its structure, the invisible hands that carried it across oceans and empires. Outside the window, St. Peter's Square is quiet. The obelisk casts its shadow in a perfect line, a needle pointing through centuries of construction, conquest, and devotion. The curator imagines the river that flows beneath, both literal and metaphorical, the currents of secrecy, of knowledge preserved in silence. He thinks of the scribes, monks, and Templars who protected this story, and of the generations that forgot, erased, or reinterpreted it to suit their times. To release the text is to acknowledge them all, to admit the river beneath the marble. The envelope tempts him with possibility, yet caution weighs heavier. What of the faithful? What of those unprepared for the echo of Osiris within the gospel? What of doctrine and discipline, and the centuries invested in orthodoxy? He closes his eyes, letting memory drift. He sees the flames that consumed Alexandria, the papyri that survived, the ships slipping down the Nile, the monks in Rome, the Templars hiding treasures in crypts. He sees the cycles of dismemberment and rising, the patterns encoded in symbols and architecture, in hymns and rituals. The world is not ready, perhaps, or perhaps it is, and only he can decide. He sets the envelope down gently, as if placing a crown on a pillow. It will remain sealed for now, a promise and a threat. Someday, someone will follow the clues, trace the river, and find the current that never ceased. Until then, he protects it, cherishes it, and lives with the weight of choice. The text is not lost, it is waiting, as the city above moves on, unaware of the secret river flowing beneath the marble. In this quiet room, the world's most delicate balance is preserved, suspended between revelation and restraint, faith and knowledge, silence and the possibility of truth. The river flows silently beneath the streets, beneath the stones, beneath the eyes of the city above. Its presence is constant though unseen, a quiet pulse threading through time, carrying stories, echoes, and memory. You do not need to touch the water to feel it, just to follow the pattern, the lines etched in architecture, the curves of symbols, the rhythm of chants long forgotten. Even if the papyrus itself is never found, the story is there, whispered in every shadow, in every sunrise over the domes and spires of Rome. Walk the streets, and you will notice the traces, subtle but persistent. The spirals in a chapel's fresco, the curve of a statue's arm, the repetition of a motif that no one explained. They are not random. They are deliberate, a code of continuity, a way for generations to preserve the message without a single word on a single scroll. The river remembers even when humans forget. Its memory is patience itself, unbroken and eternal. Think of the chants in Coptic monasteries, rising from stone walls at dawn. Words of devotion layered over older words, rhythms echoing the pulse of the Nile, the heartbeat of Osiris, and the faith of the fledgling Christian communities. The cycle of death and rebirth, loss and recovery, persists in song. Listen carefully, and you can hear it. Not in translation, not in meaning, but in cadence, in repetition, in breath. The river remembers even when books are burned and archives closed. Icons speak the same language. Mary in blue, Isis in shadow, the dark Madonna watching silently across centuries. Sculptors and painters did not know what they preserved, but they encoded the story in line, in colour, in posture. The patterns are everywhere, waiting for recognition, for comprehension. Even in the smallest detail, the river flows. Architecture, too, bears witness. Obelisks, rising in squares, columns placed to mirror stars, labyrinths of masonry, mapping a hidden topography. Each choice is a message, each shadow a verse, each alignment a line of continuity. The river remembers every decision, every hand that shaped stone and ink. The lost gospel is not gone. It is refracted through time, transformed into symbols, into ritual, into the world itself. And so, Whether the scroll is ever uncovered or remains forever sealed, the river flows on. It is in the whisper of wind across the marble, in the quiet glow of a candle in a dark chapel, in the hum of history waiting to be understood. The message endures, carried in silence, in pattern, in form. The river remembers. You do not need a papyrus to know it. You only need to look, to listen, to feel. The lost gospel was never lost. It lives in everything around us, flowing quietly beneath our feet, whispering across centuries, eternal and alive.